Distinguished participants, it is my pleasure to join you today at the Global Solutions Summit and to kick off the session on realigning our economic models in a way that delivers for people and the planet, or as you call it, achieving the vision for a recoupled economy. Prospects for global recovery are uncertain. Yet, there are reasons for optimism. As we gather in this vibrant forum, most countries are still facing serious challenges related to the COVID-19 pandemic. The global economic outlook has improved over recent months. Yet, uncertainty remains. Our latest analysis projects a global GDP growth rate of 5.6% for 2021 and of 4% in 2022. Well, several OECD countries have announced large fiscal packages in addition to the support provided during the crisis, while monetary policy has remained accommodative. But at the end of the day, massive and fast rollout of vaccination is, at least in the short run, our best economic policy. At the Global Health Summit that took place just a few days ago, under the leadership of the Italian G20 presidency and the EU Commission, I mentioned that we urgently need to accelerate the production and equitable distribution of vaccines. Globally, fewer than 1 in 10 people have received at least one dose of a COVID-19 vaccine. 1 in 10. It is crucial that vaccines are directed towards areas of greatest need, and that commitments to sharing intellectual property and facilitating technology transfer are encouraged. But an economic rebound is not enough. What we need is a full-fledged recovery. A recovery that heals the scars of this crisis. A recovery that addresses the structural weaknesses of our economies that pre-existed the crisis and have been often magnified by the crisis itself. And a recovery that puts us on a sounder footing to address the systemic challenges and the threats that we are facing. In other words, using this recovery to build forward better. Well, let me start with the immense challenge of inequality. At the OECD, we have been keeping track of inequalities for decades. And the picture is dire. In terms of income inequality, within a generation, the income earned by the top 10% as compared to the bottom 10% has increased from a factor of 7 to a factor of 10. So it's going in the wrong direction and fast. The wages of the low-paid workers have been stagnant. Vulnerable groups, such as the lower educated, underemployed minorities, groups of migrants, they were hit the hardest by the COVID-19 crisis, perpetuating and deepening pre-existing inequalities. Youth unemployment rate surged to nearly 20% in April 2020 and has only partially recovered since. It's now at around 14%, but it's significantly above pre-pandemic rates. Women were disproportionately affected by additional care burdens and also as frontline health workers. It's not often known that they make up for 70% of the workforce of the health sector. They are in the front line against the pandemic. And recent events have brought into the spotlight how, these pandemics have been toxic for the cohesion of our social fabric. And, of course, down the road, as a consequence, for how robust our democracies are. We at the OECD have shown that inequalities in the resulting unequal access to opportunities have had an adverse impact. They affect the accumulation of human capital. They affect labor market participation. And in the end, they affect productivity. And therefore, they affect growth. Now, how can our economies recover and flourish when a significant proportion of people are held back, preoccupied with day-to-day struggles to make ends meet, instead of investing in their future skills, on health, on well-being? But the inequality and the inclusiveness challenge is even more pressing if you consider another absolute policy emergency, which is the fight against climate change. Our single most important intergenerational responsibility. Let's face it, we will not be able to transition towards a net zero economy, towards net zero societies, if we do not address the political and the social acceptability, and if we're not able to engineer the just transition that is necessary. So we need to recouple, align the social and the climate imperatives, which have become the two faces of the same coin. The OECD has just published a report analyzing the impact of environmental policies in several OECD countries over a decade. We have looked at the impact of those policies at the micro level, firms, industry, jobs, productivity, competitiveness, and even on carbon leakage. And two clear messages come out of this analysis. First, in aggregate, the economic impact of those policies is limited, while the environmental benefits, such as the reduction of carbon emissions, are significant, if not spectacular. Now, yet, and this is the second message, the distributional impact of those measures is equally significant, and it's negative in a number of sectors and in the less productive segments of the economy. In other words, there will be losers and there will be winners. And the strongest today, which are the most productive, shall be the winners of tomorrow. So we have to use this as an encouragement, but at the same time, think about those that may lose some ground and how to help them. Taking this integrated approach to climate change and to social justice requires breaking silos and putting people at the center of economic policy. And this has been my goal over the past 15 years at the helm of the OECD. Over the past decade, we developed the tools to help our members and our partner countries take on this challenge, relying on our newly established OECD Center for Well-being, Inclusion, Sustainability, and Equal Opportunity, what we call the WISE Center. And we're now developing a dashboard of indicators that would precisely track the recovery in 4 key dimensions: strength, resilience, inclusiveness, and sustainability. And the idea is that this dashboard of indicators would contribute to guide a balanced policy response. It would be like a GPS. It would be telling us whether we're on the right track or not. So count on the OECD in the efforts towards recoupling the economy to continue working with you and for you to design, develop, and deliver better policies for better lives. Thank you.
Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to this panel discussion for the 2021 Global Solutions Summit. I'm Declan Curry. I'm a business journalist and broadcaster. I've been reporting on business, the economy, and politics for very nearly 30 years now. Our theme for this discussion is how to achieve the vision for a recoupled economy. The session description says our economy must serve human needs, improve social progress, and environmental sustainability. And you may have just heard one of the more powerful voices in the global economy, the OECD Secretary General, Angel Gurria, talk about the importance of delivering for people on climate, on jobs and skills, in healthcare, and in fighting the pandemic. He said that there are serious challenges and uncertainty, but reasons for optimism. So how are we to achieve this? We're going to discuss this over the next 30 minutes with Colm Kelly, who advises businesses around the world. He's the global leader for purpose policy and corporate responsibility at the global consultancy PwC. With Colin Meyer, who's a professor at the University of Oxford. He's researched and written extensively about these issues, including in his book, Prosperity, Better Business Makes the Greater Good. With Eric Rickmers, who's a serial entrepreneur, a former politician, and founder of the New Institute, an innovative think tank tackling the great challenges of today's society. And Nairi Woods, who's Dean of the Blavatnik School of Government and Professor of Global Economic Governance at Oxford University. Her work is focused on the challenges of globalization and global development and the role of enhanced governance. She's also an advisor to the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the African Leadership Institute, among others, and has advised the IMF. You are also welcome to join in our discussion on social media. The hashtag is Global Solutions or hashtag GSS2021. So let's start by identifying responsibility and capacity. And we're looking for examples here of where achievement has already been made. We're looking for good business models, successful implementation in policy areas. Professor Colin Mayer, perhaps you can start us off on this. What works?
Well, there have been remarkable success stories over the last few years. Just take the way we're communicating with each other at the moment, internet connectivity through Zoom, Teams, etc. Think about social networking, getting the Black Lives Matter campaign, Me Too campaigns going, home deliveries of Amazon, Deliveroo, keeping us going through the pandemic, the sharing economy, Uber and Airbnb, and what happened in relation to pharmaceuticals and vaccines. And we've seen something significant happening in the energy industry, with oil companies no longer being oil companies, but being energy companies there to solve energy problems. Just had the votes by shareholders at meetings of Chevron, ExxonMobil and Shell this week, reinforcing that problem. So there are lots of successes, but they're all creating problems. Gig economy workers, no security of employment, abuse of personal data, lack of access to medicines, environmental damage of deliveries, the risk of renewables making energy unaffordable or inaccessible in certain parts of the world. So we're solving problems, but we're also creating problems. And we've got to stop doing that. And to stop doing that, one of the key elements is to get the measurement of what we're doing right. We're simply mismeasuring lots of things at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much. Colin Kelly of PwC, you've spoken at this summit and at previous Global Solutions Summits about just exactly that point, the importance of measuring what matters.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Declan. And of course, that means you then, first of all, have to define what matters. And as Colin said, that means that you have to take into account a much broader range of value than, frankly, we do in our current business models or indeed in our current economic models. And I think that clearly then relates to the prosperity of people and the sustainability of the planet. But that's not what we currently do, which means that our models for defining what we value in that sense have to change. We have to then measure and report against progress in that context. But I really need to be clear about this. We also need to go further, because it also means we have to embed responsibility for delivering against those broader value-based outcomes in the decision-making framework that we have for businesses and for economies. And again, that is not where we stand at the moment.
Nairi Woods, there's a role in all of this, of course, for government, for business, and broader society as well. And what it comes down to are examples of what matters, what we value.
Yes, I mean, people think about recoupling as a recoupling between the economy and the political system, between firms and governments. But of course, we're facing in every single region of the world a recoupling that's needed between the rulers and the ruled. We've seen a backlash against political establishment even before COVID, and now COVID has really harshly exposed just how many families across Britain, across the United States, across Brazil, across South Africa, have lost. It's not just their own living standards that they feel that they're losing. It's the chance that their children will have better lives. And when you strip people of that sense, you start getting real anger. And that anger quickly gets channeled into a backlash, which can be used by all kinds of politicians to channel division. So for me, recoupling is also about recoupling the polity. It's about ensuring that we have politicians and governments who actually know how to connect to people, who know how to glue the polity back together to move forward. And then they can start uncovering why it is, what it is that these anxieties are that Colm and Colin have unearthed.
Thank you. Art Rickmers, you have a background in business, you have a background in politics, you remain incredibly well informed about both those spheres. How does this appear to you?
Well, I mean, the reason for establishing the new institute is my growing concern about the course of the world. We are clearly on a trajectory towards the destruction of our natural habitat and running the real risk of another event of mass extinction of life on Earth. Now, the politicians are saying the right things, as Ms. Merkel in the introductory session did, but only now they are starting to deliver on it. So in the business world, in the world, a change is on the way. That's encouraging, but it's not enough, and it's not fast enough. And we have to be more ambitious to avoid a great hardship for humankind. So, and for that, the entire design of the system needs to change. We need to act towards the motto of the summit, towards a great realignment, leading to an ecologic, socio-economic transformation. That's a great challenge that we have ahead of us.
As someone who
the
has
new institute
I beg your pardon, carry on.
The new institute is designed to address these challenges. We are trying to bring together great thinkers from across the world in an interdisciplinary and transsectoral way. And indeed, one of our founding programs, which we developed with our colleagues at Oxford University and many others, is based on value and values. We believe that we really have to try to develop a global secular value system in order to start the dialogue on a very foundational basis.
Okay, thank you. Professor Colin Meyer, you mentioned when we were talking about where there are examples of success that has already been achieved, you mentioned some of the incredibly significant developments in the financing of the oil industry this week, where we saw rebel directors who are concerned about climate change put on the board of Exxon. We've seen votes by shareholders at Chevron. We've seen a court ruling ordering the Anglo-Dutch oil giant Shell to reduce its emissions. Are these examples of where you can bring about successful change through the use of law, the use of public pressure and reputation, and the use of the clout of investment funds?
It's very helpful. It's certainly a move in the right direction, and it would have been outrageous if some of these initiatives had not been successful. Is it enough? Not nearly enough. It's just a start of a process that's got a long way to go. Let's take this transition from oil to energy companies that are there to solve problems. At the moment, the way in which it's being thought about is very much in relation to, it's all about getting CO2 emissions down. Now, that obviously is absolutely critically important, but it's not just a transition. It's about a just transition. And a just transition really needs to start from the opposite end. It needs to start from a position of saying, how does one ensure that everyone around the world has access to the energy resources that they need and can afford those resources, and that it's delivered in a form that is not going to destroy our environment going forward. So we need to think about this in terms of not creating problems at the same time as we solve other problems. And it's that holistic approach that underpins a notion of putting the values that we're seeking to achieve first and include value, financial value within that, but to recognize we're trying to create more than just financial value. We're trying to include social values and values that relate to the environment and nature as well.
Sure, but what are the levers on business policy that will help us achieve that? Is it government framework? Is it government instruction? Is it stakeholder pressure? What's going to bring it about?
Okay, so this is exactly what we at the British Academy and the Future of the Corporation program are setting out, a comprehensive program of reform to shift from the type of economies that we have at the moment to ones that really are purposeful. And by a purposeful one, I mean companies that help solve problems profitably, not producing problems. And the key policy levers that are required to do that are, first, law, to put purpose at the heart of company law. Secondly, to ensure that there's a regulatory system that makes it the case that companies do not profit from producing problems. And then we need to think about the ownership of companies and the way in which we align the governance of them so that the directors of companies recognize their responsibilities in terms of delivering solutions, not problems, and are held to account for that. To hold them to account, we have to measure what they're doing properly, and we have to ensure that the incentives within their organizations are related to the delivery of purposes that solve problems.
Nairi Woods, listening to that and reflecting on what you said in your earlier answer about the need to reconnect between the governed and the governing, that scale of change that Professor Meyer describes, how do you instill public and stakeholder confidence in that so it doesn't feel like something that is theoretical and imposed?
Yeah. So, well, first, the government actually has to step forward and set safety bars. It cannot be, we've seen a shifting of risk to some of the lowest paid workers in all of our economies. For example, consumer industries using 0-hour contracts, where they risk not having enough consumers coming through the door, and they're passing that to the very lowest paid of the workers in our societies. How do you stop companies doing that? You can't just expect individual companies to act. That's where the government needs to set a level playing field and say, actually, no one can do that. You can't cheat and compete, or you can't compete with other companies by simply crushing your lowest paid workers. So the first thing is the government has to step forward and set safety bars. What's really interesting to me, interviewing CEOs across Britain, is how many of them are keen and supportive of seeing a government do that. They want to see the government do that so that they can compete much more fairly. Yes, as Colin says, companies need to set their own goals. They need to step forward to represent the communities they live in. But also, in my view, academics, and I'm sitting here in Oxford University, we need to step forward and do much better research with PwC, with other partners, about the effects of well-intentioned targets. Once companies want to act on this, they want to set targets, whether it's on diversity or climate or environmental or community relations, there's far too little research about what actually happens once you set that target. Yes, accountants and auditors can come and count whether you're achieving it, but what we really need to know are what are the good things that well-intentioned companies can do that really are going to build resilient societies and economies in 5 years' time. So I think there's a job for each of us.
Colin Kelly of PwC, just pick up on that point that it's all very well having well-intentioned incentives, but they've got to be effective, and you've got to avoid unintended consequences.
Well, I would wholeheartedly agree, and I particularly like the language that Nairi has used, because I fully agree. I think you do need policymakers to step out to define the boundaries within which business operates so that the competition takes place within those boundaries, and those boundaries have to be consistent with positive outcomes for people and planet, as Colin has said. But I think we're also opening up a really critical dimension of this conversation, which is that as business leaders step forward to want to do the right thing, it is essential that that is a collaborative process with academics and researchers, as Nairi has said, and with governments in the context of redefining that policy framework. Because what we're really all now talking about here is a redesign of the system that we currently have. That's critically important to understand, because it means that we have to define what we want to be in the future and then implement the specific steps to make that happen. That's an arduous journey, but we need to get on with it quickly, because these challenges that we now face, and we all face them, no matter which hat we wear, they are increasingly urgent.
But Colin Kelly, what do you say to business leaders who might listen to that and say, that's not my job. I'm busy at the minute surviving a pandemic, finding skilled workers that I need for the future, dealing with automation and new technology. All this stuff you're talking about, very nice to have, but I'm busy.
Yeah, I don't have too much sympathy for that argument, to be blunt, because actually the pandemic, this awful pandemic, keeps teaching us lessons about what really matters. And unless businesses participate in the process of the redesign that I've just described, we will find ourselves rolling globally from crisis to crisis. That is neither sustainable nor acceptable, whether it's moral or otherwise. Which means that I think growing numbers of business leaders, as Nairi has said, actually do recognize the significance of contributing in a way which reflects the interests of their communities, their stakeholders, and the planet more broadly. I think increasing numbers of business leaders are on that journey.
Thank you. Mark Wickmers, as someone who has been in business and politics, someone who's been an entrepreneur, I know you'll have been struck as I was when Professor Meyer referred to companies no longer being able to profit from, shall we call them, bad actions. The hard truth is that many companies do profit from unsavory activities. How is that change to be brought about?
Well, I think there are less and less companies who would fall into that category. And I mean, we clearly have to make sure that the business world is becoming part of the solution rather than the cause of the problem. And one of the problems indeed is a lack of good leadership, which creates uncertainty in the economic world. Businesses have to know where to employ their capital and where to employ it in the long term. So what businesses need from governments is a legal framework, as Colin stressed, with targets and with incentives to direct the flow of capital in a way that enhances the transformation towards an ecologic, socio-economic transformation. And those must be set, of course, within three major aspects. Number one is, and that is number one, our planetary boundaries. And we are feeling their limitations now with looming climate change and the loss of biodiversity as the primary signifiers. It is, of course, the material needs of the people. We have to feed the world. And it is number three, their social embeddedness, i.e. an agency. People need to take back control over their lives and have the freedom of choice. And failing to deliver of any of these three aspects will then not be successful for the overall endeavor.
Okay, thank you. Nairi Woods, how do we achieve this commonality of purpose that we are discussing? How do we get business, government, society, populations all working and pulling in the same direction?
Mm-hmm. So, well, I think for a start, you've got to do it seriously. I think seeing from government, one of the problems for business leaders who want to engage properly with government is that they face an ever-changing parade of ministers with an ever-changing parade of policies. And that's just not going to work. If you want people seriously to engage, you've got to give them a serious partner to engage with. And if we want to really unleash this new aspiration of business across the board to be part of rebuilding, we've got to put clear, simple goalposts out there and safety bars. If those goalposts are shifted by the government every time there's a new minister or every time there's a change of government, then business can really just, they keep their head down for survival. So I think, and I'm talking about, the well-intended and good business, not the opportunists. So I think for me, speaking on, looking at what is it government needs to do, it needs to offer itself as a clear, consistent, predictable partner. And that means paying more attention to the issues and what needs to be done and slightly less to the greasy pole of politics and the sordid politics inside each political party.
Nairi, let me add to that analysis of yours, this observation, this question from one of our viewers, from Małgorzata Rogalinska from the University of Lodz. What can be done to empower citizens to drive this transformation? And it's an interesting observation because in the last half decade, we've seen a rise in populism driven by political leaders saying to their populations, stop change.
Mm-hmm. So I think the way to empower citizens is to really think about what local politics looks like and how it connects to mainstream politics and to capital cities around the world. And it's very interesting to me how many businesses say, look, it would be more theoretically efficient to work with central government, but it's impossible because it keeps changing. We'd rather work in our local community, work with the local government, work with devolved or state government, and then build up. And I think that same aspiration is there for citizens. Although it's true that we're all connected globally, what it's meant for people's identity is those identities have become ever more local and more immediate and more familiar. That's what scarcity and anxiety does to people. So I think we have to start there, and we can. This is not a radical suggestion. Every country in the world has forms of community organization and local organization. We've now got to put our heads into thinking, how can business collaborate with citizens groups, communities, and government to make things better at the local level, and then let that aggregate up to the central government level?
Thank you. Professor Colin Meyer, let me ask you to address another question from our audience, this from Cornelius Kruger at the Humboldt University in Berlin, who observes that the UN has already put forward standards for business and for human rights. Where's the teeth? What are the regulatory tools to ensure that these standards are upheld?
Well, they're beginning to have a significant influence. They were set at a very high level initially. What we're now seeing is that there's a move towards trying to standardize ways of measuring performance of companies across the world, with in particular organizations such as the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation, which is potentially one of the most influential standard setters, looking to establish sustainable standards for accounting. Now, that will be very significant in terms of bringing some teeth to the SDGs, but it's going to take a lot more than that to really ensure that the objectives of the SDGs are met in the way in which they're intended. We need to go beyond just having these things set at high levels by international standard setters. We need to have them embedded in the way in which companies think about their own particular objectives. And so what we need is a mixture of the top-down approach that we're seeing happening from organizations like the IFRS, but also we need to make it a requirement on companies and the boards of companies to set out how they're going to be addressing the problems that we're talking about. What are the values that the companies have in terms of doing that, and showing how they're creating their measures by which they're going to report on the extent to which they're actually doing it.
Thank you. Ark Rickmers, is that going to do the trick? Regulatory change, maybe a bit of taxation, a bit of tub thumping by influential political leaders? Will that do it?
Yes, I mean, of course, it won't go without. As I said before, it is really sort of the governance that is asked here. We need to have a new regulatory system in order to provide a framework for businesses and to steer the allocation of capital. But the good news is that it is really happening from a market perspective. You simply can't sell a product anymore in hardly any area if you are not doing good. I mean, the new generation, the young generation, is putting a lot of pressure. Increasingly, they take over responsibility in businesses and family enterprises and as investors. And that is what makes me really hopeful, is that change is on the way due to market pressures.
Thank you. Colin Kelly of PwC, I suppose the question is, who are the critical enablers and how do we enable them?
Well, we've actually talked about an interesting mix of sources of pressure, if that's the word, from a variety of different places, right? You described, for example, the significant ramp up of investor focus on these issues and the immediate response which follows when that happens at sufficient scale. We've talked about the need for a policy framework to create the guardrails, the boundaries within which business operates, so that decision-making within business follows those guardrails. And actually, by definition, therefore, Declan, I think the answer is that it needs all of these things. We're talking about systems change, which means you need that drive, that pressure. And frankly, you need that norm to be established by all of those players. But let's not declare victory too soon, right? There are very many good things happening, but I don't think that we should assume that we are moving at sufficient pace or scale. And I'd go back to what Nairi said earlier. I think we do need this framing of what is required, as Colin has described. And then we need collaboration between the categories of stakeholders necessary to really start driving this hard. And climate is the perfect example, but it's not the only one. I'm a little worried, actually, that if we continue to drive very hard against climate, we run the risk of not addressing the kinds of issues that, from a social perspective, Nairi has described. And that clearly has to maintain the same degree of priority here.
And which the OECD Secretary General identified in his opening remarks for this discussion as well: employment, skills, automation, healthcare, fighting COVID, which of course is still a major issue around the world. Colin, given the urgency, given the scale, is incremental change, nudge here, push there, is that enough?
Oh, well, by definition, no. And I think that's the essence of this conversation. I think the work that Colin has done with the British Academy is very powerful in terms of laying out a route map for the steps that need to be taken to redefine the policy framework, the regulatory framework, if you like. He's also touched on the global standard for transparency and reporting with IFRS. But frankly, we need what Nairi described. We need that level of policy leadership coming from government, and we need business leaders willing to step up and proactively engage to redefine what that looks like in practice to deal with the kinds of issues that you've just summarized. So I'm not pessimistic, Declan. I continue to believe there are enough willing actors continuing to drive the agenda forward. But we have to be clear, they cannot be exceptions. We have to reframe the policy agenda in a way which drives the pace and scale to deal with these issues.
Thank you very much. I know those of you who've been watching and been stimulated by this discussion will join me in thanking our splendid and sparkling panelists. They were Colin Kelly of PwC, Professor Colin Mayer of the University of Oxford, Arka Rickmers, the founder of the New Institute, and Nairi Woods, who's the Dean of the Blavatnik School of Government and also a Professor of Global Economic Governance at Oxford University. I'm Declan Curry. I want to thank you for your questions and your observations. Please do continue to take part and be part of the discussion here at Global Solutions on social media and in the chat function. Thank you for your attention today, and stay with us for continuing discussions here at Global Solutions.